I would like to do an Advent meditation looking at the incarnation of Jesus Christ from John chapter 1, verses 1 and following through 18. It's a beautiful prologue that begins this great gospel of John. John is writing to show that Jesus is the Christ and that by believing you might have life through his name. And so I'll be translating from the Greek and talking about the text by way of interpretation. It begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was face to face, pros ton theon, with God, and the Word was divine. Notice John begins his great gospel by making three statements about Jesus Christ. First of all, he is eternal. In the beginning was the Word. Secondly, he was always a distinct person next to God the Father. That is, the Word was face to face with God, is the way I would render the Greek pros ton theon. And then finally, the Word was divine. And the way it reads in Greek, it does not have the article before theos because it is showing quality of deity and still keeping individual identity between the Word and God. And so what it's really saying is, as my understanding, the Word was divine. The Word was fully God. Three great statements. We might ask the question, where does the idea of word come from? And I think it goes back to Genesis 1, where all the way through we have Vayomer Elohim, Vayomer, and God said. It's interesting, in one of the Jewish Targums, it will translate, which is the Aramaic rendition of the Hebrew, it will render that great text something like this. And God said, and a little bit later it will say, and the Word said. So the word is memra in Aramaic, and here John is translating with the word logos, or writing with the word logos. So I think John is coming from a Jewish background as he's writing these great words. So in the beginning was the logos, was the Word, eternality. Then the Word was face to face with God. That is, Jesus, who was fully God, was always face to face with God the Father. And finally, the Word was full deity, had that quality. And then John goes on, this one was in the beginning face to face with God. No one else was in the beginning face to face with God. It was this one, speaking of Jesus. It's also interesting as we come to verse 3, we're told that all things agenata came to be, or had a beginning with, let's say, all of creation, where Jesus never had a beginning. He was eternal. I pointed out many times that the verb ein in Greek is used 3 times in verse 1, and the verb agenata, to become, is used in verse 3 in contrast to verse 1. That is, all things had a beginning or came to be, but Jesus didn't come to be, he always was. And then John the Baptist in verse 6, he was, notice there was a man that came to be, agenata, having been sent from God, but not face to face with God. So there's a contrast there in the second clause of verse 1 with what we see here in verse 6. And then finally, notice verse 14, and the word sarx agenata, the Word became flesh. It's interesting, who was the Word that became flesh? Going back to the third clause of verse 1, the Word was God, or fully divine. So we have from verse 1, I think, this threefold development, showing that all things had a beginning where Jesus didn't. That John came from the Father, but not face to face with the Father. And lastly, that Jesus took upon human form, but yet he was always divine. Then, as we move on, notice in verse 4, it says, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men." He not only is the creator of all things, that is, all things came to be through him, and without him came to be not one thing which has come to be, but he's the source of life, spiritual life. By the way, let me just make a comment about all things having a beginning with Jesus. He is the agent of creation, according to John here. And I'm reminded that the nearest galaxy, they tell us, is 2.5 million light years away. Traveling at the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second, in 2 seconds we zip past the moon. We still have 2.5 million years of travel time at that speed to get to the nearest galaxy. And that to me is mind-boggling. And yet Jesus spoke it into being, we're told here. He's the creator. But in him then is life. And he can give eternal life because he is such a creator. And he gave life, we're told all the way in Genesis 1, and John's referring back to that text, and the life was the light of men. And I believe here what we're seeing is the life that Christ has was the truth for mankind. In other words, light, I think, meaning truth in Johannine theology. And then as we go on, the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness did not comprehend it or did not take it down. It's interesting, the light continues to shine. And I think we're looking at the resurrection. The light could not be extinguished. It continues to shine. And the darkness did not kateleven, and that word can have a double meaning, did not overtake it nor comprehend it. And I think both are true. In other words, the darkness could not, can I say, mug the light. The light continues to shine. But on the other hand, also, until one comes to know Christ, one cannot comprehend what he is about. And I think John is driving both points home. And then as we move to verse 6, notice he says there was a man having been sent from God, and his name was John. This one came for a witness in order that he might testify concerning the light, that all might believe through him. That one was not the light, but he came that he might witness concerning the light. What a beautiful statement here. John, having been sent from God, came to bear witness to the one who was the light. He wanted all to believe in Jesus. And John was not the light, but he only came that he might testify concerning the light. I'll never forget a Greek class I had years ago where the professor pointed out a later couple verses in this chapter where John is approached by the priests and the Levites, and they ask him, "Who are you?" And he replied, answered, and he denied that he was the Christ. And there's 5 words in Greek. He said, "Ego uk emi ha Christos," that is, I am not the Christ. Then they ask him, "Are you Elias? Are you Elijah?" And he says, "Uk emi." His answers becoming shorter and shorter. 2 words in Greek, I am not. Then, "Are you the prophet of Deuteronomy 18?" And he has one answer, "Ooh." In other words, his answers became shorter and shorter. The answer was "ooh," meaning no. And so they said, "Well, who are you?" He said, "Well, I'm just a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord." I can remember way back in seminary where the professor said, "Men, we're all just voices. And our goal is to simply cry in the wilderness of this world that basically we ourselves are not to be elevated, but we are to point people to the light, which is Jesus Christ. And so, what a beautiful thought here that I learned years ago in a Greek exegesis course. So we go on. He was the genuine light, which is enlightening every man coming into the world. And I think the thought here is by his coming into the world, he provided a genuine light so that by coming to him, one can know the spiritual truth of eternal salvation. And he goes on and says he was in the world, and the world came to be through him, but the world did not know him. In other words, he was in the world, that is, he became human, and the world came to be through him, that is, the world was created through his agency, through him as the agent, but the world did not know him. And know here in the Greek, egno, is related to the Hebrew yada, I believe, which means to know intimately. The world did not. They might know intellectually about Jesus, but they did not know him experientially. And we're told he came into his own things, but his own did not receive him. And here the Greek is very interesting. He came, and we have the neuter, ta idia, his own things, and hoi idioi, his own ones, did not receive him. And I think he's simply talking here about, at that time, many of the Jewish leaders were looking for someone else as the Messiah, so they did not receive him. By the way, this is not anti-Semitic because Jesus was Jewish, and so was John, and so were the apostles. What it's simply saying is he did not get a wide reception, even though he was Jewish and he came unto those that were also at the time, and they did not receive him, but there were those that did. Many did. Paul and many others we learn in the book of Acts. And so John is simply, again, not making any kind of anti-Semitic statement here, but simply saying he did not get a wide reception at the beginning, is the thought. But then, as many as received him, whether Jews or Gentiles, John is writing as a disciple, as many as received him, he gave to them power to become the children of God, so that anyone, whether Jewish, whether Gentile, that receive him, John says, are given the power to become children of God to those that believe in his name. So the way we become children of God is by believing in his name. And how does that happen? It happens through a divine birth, who are not out of bloods, and I take that to mean not out of the blood of a mother and father, not out of bloods that way, nor out of the will of the flesh, not out of human desire to simply work it out, nor out of the will of a man. I'm understanding this to mean the will of a male to have a child. It's not like a human birth, but have been begotten of God. The most important thing John is saying is a new birth and a spiritual birth. And John will address this more fully in chapter 3. So one needs to be born again. One needs to be born from above, John is saying. And by doing that, one then becomes a child of God. And, often you can talk to people, having been a pastor for years, and you would say, do you know the Lord? Are you a child of God? And the person will say, well, I hope I am. But the good news here is if we believe in Jesus and accept him, then John says we become tekna, children, theou, of God. And then John goes on, and notice the word became flesh. Notice sarx agenata and askenosin pitched his tent among us, and we gazed upon his glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So Jesus became flesh. Now, this does not mean he was born in sin, because we know from the book of Hebrews that he who knew no sin became a sin offering for us, but he became fully human. He would get tired. He basically wept. In other words, he was fully human, but without sin, and also fully divine. It's interesting. We had to have both to happen before he could provide that eternal redemption. He had to be human to identify with us, and yet without sin, and yet he had to be fully God to carry out the great redemption that he did on the cross and in the resurrection. And so the word became flesh, and askenosin. This word in the Greek is from skenao, related to the Hebrew shechan, to dwell, and it means pup tented. That is, he pitched his tent among us. He dwelt among us, and we gazed upon. And in the Hebrew Bible, when the tabernacle was built, the glory of God came and filled the tent of meeting, and it was the shechan, it dwelt, and the Shekhinah is the dwelling of God. Here we have the same Greek, a kind of an expression from skenao. And so he pitched his tent among us for 3.5 years, and that's implied, it's not stated here, that is 3.5 years, and we gazed upon his glory. In other words, we gazed upon him and we saw his glory. The verb here in the Greek, theamai, means to give close attention to. I'm reminded of 1 John, that which we have seen, that which we have heard, that which we have handled, our hands have handled concerning the word of life. So it's not just a momentary glance. We gazed upon his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of truth and full of grace and truth. By the way, I love the Nicene Creed, where it says that Jesus is begotten, eternally not made, over against Arianism that was talking about Jesus being the first of creation. But Jesus is eternally begotten, and it's the only time we've ever seen the unique begetting of God in the second person of the Trinity, who became fully human and yet without sin. And he's full of grace and truth. By the way, these two expressions define what God is in Psalm 117. He is full of grace and truth, so he is divine. And John testifies concerning him and has cried, saying, "This is he of whom I said, the one who comes behind me has come before me, because he was first." In other words, the one coming after me has really come before me because he was prior to me. That's the thought, showing that he's eternal, where John isn't. Because out of his fullness, we all have received grace in the place of grace. In other words, a surplus of grace. We received his fullness, a merit that we don't deserve. But the law had its beginning in Moses, because the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So there's a difference here between the law, which had its beginning with Moses, but grace and truth, again, showing the divinity of our Lord, came through Jesus Christ. I'm reminded how in some rabbinic sources, they will say that that God looked into the Torah that was with him at the very beginning, and then from that created the world. And the focus in the rabbis was to put a strong emphasis in the Torah. It's interesting to me that John, who no doubt had read that as a Jewish student, would have said, the one who was with the Father from all eternity was the Logos, was Jesus. Moses was the origin of the law. So I think there's a interesting, contrast there between Jesus and the Torah, because he is the eternal Torah. And then we go on, no one has ever seen God. The only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, that one has exegeted him. John concludes by saying no one has ever seen God because God is a spirit. But the monogenes to us, the only begotten God, who being in the bosom of the Father, that one has exegeted him. What a beautiful statement here. The only one who was fully God in the second person of the Trinity came and exegeted. The word he uses in the Greek here, exegesata, from exegeo. That is, he exegeted Jesus. And Jesus exegeted the Father, and he was in the bosom of the Father and is still in the bosom of the Father, having entered that relationship. And by the way, that's a relationship of honor. At the Last Supper, the one that Jesus loved was reclining in his bosom. In the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, remember the beggar ends up in the bosom of Abraham. That's the place of honor. And so Jesus now is resurrected, glorified in the place of honor. What a beautiful thought. I was reading a wonderful Reformed scholar, Gerhardus Voss, today, and he had a very interesting statement that he said the New Testament is very interested in eschatology. And eschatology, can I say, helps define soteriology, salvation. And I thought that was an interesting quote. And then he went on to say that believers today have already entered into the eschaton, and that we, as believers in Jesus, he said, are raised with Christ, seated with Christ in the heavenlies, the book of Ephesians, and furthermore, we now are part of that eternal commonwealth. What we're waiting for is the final concluding part of this eschaton in receiving redeemed new bodies, resurrected bodies, so that the souls have new bodies someday at the general resurrection when Christ returns. When I think about this great text, I'm reminded of an illustration I used in a sermon yesterday, how that when you think about all of this, there's the story of an atheist who's talking to a gentleman just coming from church. And he said, "Sir, tell me about your God. What is he like?" And he said, "Well, my God is big and my God is little." "Well, how can your God be big and little at the same time?" "Well, he's big enough to make this whole universe, this whole world, and all of its galaxies. But he's little enough to be born and become a little baby and grow up and ultimately die upon the cross for my sins, and to rise again the third day, and to live in my heart." So you see, my God is big and my God is little. And when I think of this great text, it's a great Advent text. Our God is big and our God is little. And John is saying that Jew and Gentiles who put their faith in him, we as Gentiles, then can become children of God, along with Jewish believers who put their faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. What a beautiful, beautiful prologue that helps us get ready for Advent.